on the basis of dissatisfaction and on the basis of the inabilities and the vulnerabilities and the capacities of states to deal with these issues and to provide an alternative path. For all of these reasons, I think, again, we have to highlight the importance of a more comprehensive approach to this development that takes into account all of the various dimensions and is able to address them in a pertinent and potent manner. While we have to recognize at the same time that we don't all have the same capabilities and capacities, and I think we have discussed this quite extensively in the differentiations that exist between the developing and the developed world and what responsibilities have to be shouldered by both sides. But let me also refer to the fact that we need to also address some of our own deficiencies when it comes to dealing with these issues. We have recognized that there is a deficiency in our medical infrastructure on the continent that has to be addressed. It has to be addressed within the context of the complementarity that exists and our relationships and partnerships beyond the continent. But certainly it's an area that has to be looked upon with greater vigor. The other issue is the recovery, and I think the recovery has to also be addressed in the context that the pandemic is still with us, and we see from the variants that are being discovered that this isn't necessarily going to be resolved by the discovery of vaccinations or the expansion of vaccinations or medications for that matter, but that this is an issue that we might have to deal with for the immediate future, and thereby we need to look at and address the potential of having to deal with it. And here the recovery is absolutely vital, and the resources that have to be directed towards the recovery, especially as the President's mentioned this morning, that the developing world has had the opportunity to inject a great deal of stimulus in terms of resetting their economic plans, but also had been able to address the health conditions through closing down that there were compensations that certainly we couldn't provide as developing countries, and we could not sustain any long-term closures because of the nature of our economies and as well the lack of resources. So this issue is also vital to be addressed with the financial institutions, with the available resources, and in the spirit of, again, solidarity and the distancing from unilateral actions. For a country which depends on 10% of its GDP on tourism, we cannot afford that this continues to be a case of unilateral action, of sanctions and closures and restrictions on travel that are not really based on any scientific data. At the same time, I think we have demonstrated over this last year and a half to 2 years our ability to sustain our social fabric and relationships and interactions through measures like we are all now demonstrating in terms of masks, in terms of vaccinations, in terms of testing, and have provided those sets of precautionary measures so as to enable our economies to continue to thrive on tourism and providing an outlet that is important at a psychological level for individuals who have been somewhat constrained over this last year, and the impact that has caused, the mental impact on especially children. So we need to be able to deal in a confident manner where we can deal with the challenges in a way that does not hamper our abilities to sustain the livelihoods of our populations. In the security dimension, undoubtedly there has been pressures that relating to the socioeconomic pressures that has instigated and exacerbated the environment that has become conducive to greater turmoil, whether internal turmoil or that of terrorism or insurgencies, or a sense of agitation that has resulted from the dynamics of the COVID and its continuance. Whenever there's a vacuum, there has to be something that fills that vacuum, and unfortunately, it is usually the organizations that are working outside the usual authority of the state that take most advantage of the situation and utilize the instability that exists to further promote their interests. But we have to also recognize that before the COVID, our continent had its maybe more than its share of unresolved conflicts that have been extended over decades without a sufficient resolution. I think the efforts of the African Union and the efforts of the international community in resolving these conflicts have not resulted in the necessary progress, but that has also led us to highlight that these situations have been exacerbated by the COVID and need to be further addressed in a more structured and substantial manner, so as to be able to provide the environment where we can deal with the health and the socioeconomic dimensions associated with the COVID in a more impactful manner. We have to, I think, again, rely on what Jean-Yves referred to as solidarity and the sovereignty between both Africa and its international and partners, but in doing so, we have to also take into account that there has to be a continuous open dialogue between the two sides, so as to put on the table those issues in a frank and constructive manner that goes beyond the national or limited interests of one side to try to supersede those interests of the other. I believe that if we are true to what we advocate in panels as this, and take this to a higher stage of relationships, both multilateral and bilateral, we can overcome and find the necessary equilibrium, but it has to be on the basis of mutual respect, recognition of the diversity that exists, and the need to deal with issues related to the stability and security of not only the continent but internationally, from that perspective of a divergence of conditions, and thereby we have to take those into account. We are not going to use the same yardstick when we do not have started from the same position of abilities and resources. And thereby we have to recognize those differentiations, those characteristics, and deal with them from a practical perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samik, for that. I think solidarity, absolutely coordination, and and also self-reliance. I think are points that came out there. Robert, Deputy Secretary of State of the U.S. For African Affairs. In a few days, President Biden will be convening a meeting, a summit of democracies, so clearly that's within this whole COVID conflict and other global issues. That's a priority for the U.S. Governance and other issues. Maybe you might want to also just explain the vision in terms of that, and how that keys into the challenges that Africa is facing today. And also, I think President Biden has also announced huge numbers of vaccines that are going to be made available to developing countries, very impressive numbers. But we also know that you're having your booster vaccines, and a lot of African countries are not even finished with their first ones. So